The fantastic, fast, and fun blend of a 4X game and a DECK builder, Hexarchy, has finally released from early access as of the 19th of October 2023, and boy, has it changed a lot since we first checked it out here on the channel way back when. And so today we return to Hexarchy, with my thanks to Yogscast Games for sponsoring this video. Please click through my link below if you're interested in checking out Hexarchy. It's available now, and now I'll start somewhere logical in the beginning. Hexarchy offers a variety of game modes, single player and multiplayer challenges. We'll come back to those later in the video, but the best place to start is naturally the tutorial, which does a good job at teaching you how these card-based mechanics lean into the game, with hammers to spend each turn, kind of like a mana, if you will, a deck of cards, of course, that you draw from, discard to with things that you don't play, but don't worry, you can draw those ones again later on, so long as they're not burnt. And of course, each type of card offers a variety of different tricks. These tech cards, for example, are kind of like historically themed booster packs, offering you a variety of new cards, developments for your deck. Inside of the actual gameplay itself, of course, you'll see a very familiar hex-based board, and that's because this is ultimately, of course, a 4X historical strategy game, with all of these difficult decisions that you have to make around the outside. The sheer variety of cards on offer, from units, promotions, abilities, technologies, wonders, and sort of government or cultural civics, give you a huge variety to play. And of course, fan favorites like roads, tile improvements, all of that is there inside of what is quite a succinct package. Stepping back a little bit, at the start at least of a skirmish mode, you'll of course select a civilization to play, each one bringing its own unique traits, as well as a special ability card and a unit card. The kind of thing that you would know and hopefully love and expect out of this kind of 4X historical strategy game. And of course, you'll also notice on the selection screen a variety of game mode options, from map size to game length. A short game you could play in about half an hour, and that does tend to be my favorite way to play. Longer ones might stretch up to about an hour and a half, but give or take, this is a 4X game that should last around 60 minutes. And as you settle down for your relatively quick and fast-paced playthrough, you'll obviously choose a civilization and then be met with a hand of starting cards. And like any good 4X historical strategy game, you'll start by founding your capital. The game, of course, will recommend you some reasonable spots based on the yields that are generated. Food to help your cities grow, hammers, of course, acting like a production, or again, kind of like a mana, to play cards, units, buildings, etc. I figure a settler isn't a bad place to start, and as I move through the turn, I'm rewarded for having excess food and excess luxury or happiness, my city growing its cultural borders, and of course, growing its actual population. So the fundamentals of a 4X game are all here. You'll notice I've sent a settler out, hopefully to found a new city. I'm engaging in some of these tech cards as well to try and get buildings or improvements, and I'm burning the cards that I don't want each turn, getting rid of them from my deck so that I don't draw them again, and providing me with a little bit of extra currency to spend this turn. Despite the relative fast pace of the game, there's still a lot of fan favorites and interesting things to try, explore around the map. For example, holy sites operate quite interestingly, sort of claiming land around them and providing some yield. And a fan favorite, I'm sure, these goody huts, providing all sorts of stuff, from units to bonuses, that you will of course explore and encounter as you move across the world. One of the other interesting things about the way that the resources interact is how you'll then use them to fuel both units and tile improvements. Here, I'm choosing to save a road tile for later. You'll also notice that I spent some food. That's because the economy, and specifically trade inside the game, works in quite a succinct and snappy way. You'll see here I can open up this available to buy menu, where I can select food to help my cities grow, various luxuries, or strategic resources like science, horses, that kind of thing. These items, like food, can literally just be dragged and dropped onto your cities, providing an instant boost to things like the luxury, the sort of amenity or happiness of a city, and ultimately its culture, or its food, so you can grow it up, grow it big and strong, and maybe even train some military units. Also, these currencies act as shortcuts, like with the pyramids here, allowing me to spend perhaps an alternate currency to play a card, whether it be a wonder or a unit, faster. So there's a real sense of how you manage the tempo here as well. It's a little bit more than just, say, queuing up a production queue, like it might often be in some longer form 4X games. In this case, it's much more about the tempo and the swing. Which cards will you keep? Which cards will you play? And what kind of benefits can you leverage out of your economy and the broader one? Focusing in a little bit more now on combat, as of course you will have already picked up, units are cards, play the cards, get the units. Ranged attacks and melee both feature, and you can also send units across the map to claim individual hexes for yourself, which will also help factor in to your ultimate victory condition that we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. Certain unit types can have different kinds of promotions as well, so some can attack twice, and of course civilian units will be utilized as well, largely just to settle cities. I really enjoyed the relative fast pace of the combat. Of course, it plays out very quickly on screen. As you move through turns, you see the enemy's combat play out as well, so you get a little bit of a feel for kind of how you're progressing through the game. As you move through and pick up different technologies as well, you will of course reach your way through the tech tree. The scaling up of power for military units combined with various promotions and abilities leads to combat scaling quite nicely with the pacing of the game. I find it's just fast enough to keep me interested while not being so slow that I run out of things to do. If we take a broader look at the tech tree, you'll notice that Hexarchy focuses in on a particular period of human history. In this skirmish, for example, you can see I've woven my way through the branching paths from Renaissance back to the ancient era. You don't necessarily have to pick up every technology, of course. You could burn the card and throw it away completely. And so as you pick and choose your way through, I think you'll find it does a good balance at providing enough variety to have branching paths, to have replayability, while also, of course, keeping to its fast-paced mantra. Speaking of which, it's important to note, earlier I mentioned that I quite like to set the game aggressive, right? Small map, lots of enemies, and turn their aggro up. But also playing through a slower game, a larger map, that allows you to really play through into the later game probably gives the best experience in terms of the kinds of cards and strategies you can use. Returning back to something I mentioned right at the start, the different modes on offer. One that we haven't discussed yet is this one, Hegemon. Inside of this mode, you choose a civilization, and then you compete in various sort of single-player settings and challenges to add to a global scoreboard, a weekly scoreboard where each civilization ranks. And of course, then there's the skirmish mode that we've already discussed in plenty, with the civilizations to choose from and the game settings fully at your disposal. Moving through into maybe something along the lines of the Hegemon mode, but at a slightly smaller scale, alongside the tutorials, there are a variety of challenges. Daily challenges, for example, with a simple brief throwing you into a game where you have to achieve generally, or at least in this case, but one thing. And when you complete it, of course, you get a nice breakdown just like you would in any other game, as well as a progression system that I'll touch on in a moment. And of course, you get your ranking on the leaderboards. In this case, I'm third. Important to note, this is of course recorded during the early access press preview period. Not a lot of players on that leaderboard. Maybe my third, nothing to be proud of. And of course, weekly challenges here as well, acting in the same way as the dailies over 7 days. And all of this feeds into the progression system that I mentioned earlier, a way of leveling up. It does integrate some sort of cosmetic things, a pet, an avatar, adding into your perhaps multiplayer prowess, bragging rights, but also at the earlier stages, levels 1 through 10, it's what you use to unlock civilizations and difficulty levels. And of course, speaking of those bragging rights, the game also has multiplayer, something I haven't been able to try out in this early access sort of press preview mode, but I suspect, given how fast-paced the game plays, and how relatively easy it is to pick up and have a go, I think this is maybe the fast-paced 4X multiplayer experience that many people have been looking for. Of course, time will tell. Irrespective of which game mode you're playing though, something that I'd finally like to note before we move on to really one of the big, important things is that there's a bit of difference between the modes. For example, here in this campaign, I've got access to a very special card that I've added into my deck called Inferno, allowing me to raise an enemy city. Obviously, very, very powerful, specific to this mode, but one of those really important points of difference that I think will add a little bit of replayability to Hexarchy, despite it being a fairly fast-paced 4X game. Now, of course, one of the big things that we haven't talked about yet, in fact, probably the big thing, is how you win. And to do that, you'll need victory points, located, of course, up the top left of the screen at any time during the game, and earned through a variety of actions. You might have seen it pop up just like this. During the gameplay, for example, boom, victory points, just like how a city's population might grow. Now, the victory points themselves can be gathered, as I have alluded to, in a huge variety of ways. It's not just capturing hexes through your cities, or maybe by sending units onto them to capture them manually yourself. It's also not just building wonders, although they will factor in. Here you can see one breakdown, for example, right near the end of a short game. I'm picking up my points from holy sites, from pleasing my cities, wonders, units, population, and my land. And all of that comes together to produce a score, and of course, depending on the speed or size of the game, your victory score target will vary, and you may have other objectives to fulfill. So, the package of Hexarchy has a lot to offer, and in my concluding thoughts here, I thought it was also important to mention there are some things that I just haven't covered, some detail, like the happiness, the yield penalties, and the growth dynamics of cities, including down to, if you want it, the granular level of moving and allocating workers to different tiles for different yields. Something very enjoyable if you're into that more micromanagey side of the city builders. Although I'd have to say, as far as these kinds of games go, it actually handles the automation very well. The combat too is a bit more strategic than I may have alluded to earlier in the video. For example, this flank attack here, by drawing the enemy towards me with an initial attack, I'm able to get them on the flank, potentially dealing extra damage. And of course there are terrain modifiers, forts, that kind of thing that you can build as well. And of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, Hexarchy is a game that I've been following along for a very long time, and maybe you have too if you were around the channel about 18 months ago when we first covered it in its Kickstarter phase. Now of course it has released in full. Again, of course, that link available below in the first line of the description. But to summarize, I think that it's done a brilliant job at actually solving a problem that many 4X historical strategy games have, and that is late game boredom, right? You get halfway through, you've finished exploring the map maybe, and you kind of think, oh man, this is done. It's a foregone conclusion, or there's just not enough for me to do. Hexarchy removes that problem in a couple of ways. Firstly, and most obviously, of course, as we've discussed, it's very fast-paced, and with that, it means that you can finish a game in, if you want to, as little as about half an hour, less if you're doing challenges, or a bit longer if you wish. And still it holds quite a good progression element too, not just in these daily challenges, but more broadly inside of each skirmish. There's always a technology to reach for, always some more units to grab, within, of course, those fast-paced constraints of Hexarchy. I would strongly encourage you to at least check it out, give it a look below. It seriously has been, and genuinely honestly, a game that I've been interested in for a long time. When I've covered it previously, while the channel may have been a little bit smaller, the feedback was generally very positive. I think Hexarchy truly does scratch an itch that has been missing. There's a gap in the genre, and I hope to see it fill it. Thank you so much again to Yogscast Games for sponsoring this video, and thank you, dear viewer, for watching. I'll see you next time.